Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm sorry to be out today. I had some dental work done and it's causing me an issue today. So I'm going to do this video. If you, I'm pronouncing some things funny, so my apologies. But a few things, just check out these two practice questions first before you can even pause the video, just to practice some multiple choice related to price controls, just to see how well you understand some of the concepts. And then we'll go over the two questions, okay? And then we're going to get into consumer producer surplus and deadweight loss. So this is just a little practice. So da na 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 na. Okay, so if we go over these two questions, which of the following will occur if a legal price floor is placed on a good below its free market equilibrium? Well, if I go ahead and graph this, I'll notice that this question is very problematic. Here's my demand curve, and here is my supply curve. If I note my equilibrium price, sometimes it's referred to as P star. If this is my equilibrium quantity, this is, the market that's, in equilibrium and that is allocatively efficient. As soon as I impose a price floor on the situation, I know that a price floor by definition is going to be greater than equilibrium. So we'll call this the price floor. I can put it over here too on the y-axis. Remember that, what we're suggesting is now the price is no longer, let's say, $3. It's going to be something greater than that. It's $5 or $6. So the price for the price floor is higher than the equilibrium price. As a result of that, we can look back at this question. What will happen if a legal or binding price floor is placed on a good below its free market equilibrium? Well, this is definitionally impossible. A price floor wouldn't be below the free market equilibrium. Only a price ceiling can be. So in this case, what would happen? Would there be surpluses? No. Would there be shortages? No. Underground markets? No. In this case, we're going to see the equilibrium price remain exactly the same because there is no such thing as a price floor below. So we still have a market in equilibrium. To some degree, this number one is a little bit of a trick question, but something that the AP folks like to ask to test your knowledge and understanding of price floors and ceilings. For this second question, which of the following statements about price controls might be true? And because we're asked about price controls, we can kind of assume they're talking about floors and ceilings. A price ceiling causes a shortage if the ceiling price is above the equilibrium price. Well, like before, we know that a price ceiling is something that is going to be definitionally below the equilibrium price. So we can't have a ceiling price above the equilibrium price, so A can't be correct. A price floor causes a surplus if the price floor is below the equilibrium price. Again, definitionally incorrect. These first two are just challenging your understanding of the words of ceiling and floor and where they're located relative to the equilibrium price. For answer C, price ceilings and floors result in a misallocation of resources. That would be correct. Okay, so we'll look at why that is the case. If I was to consider, well, the price ceiling is below equilibrium, the price floor is above the equilibrium price, something I know in both cases. In the case of the price floor, I recognize that at the higher price, we actually have a reduction in quantity demanded, okay, and that makes sense. It's the law of demand. If the price is increased, some people are no longer going to be willing to pay that higher price, so we actually see fewer transactions. So let's call this Q1. Despite the fact that at the higher price, suppliers might be incentivized to actually have a higher quantity supplied, if people aren't there to actually purchase it, the actual transactions that happen in the market will be at Q1 because of the quantity demanded. It only gets transacted if people come and purchase it. So Q1 is the transacted quantity. This is inefficient because Q1 is less than Q star. It's not allocatively efficient. In the case of the price ceiling, okay, we can kind of look at the same exact thing. In this case, however, the role roles are reversed, it is the quantity demanded at the lower price. Let's put the price ceiling price here. It's lower than the equilibrium price. The price ceiling price is suggesting that the quantity demanded is much greater than the quantity supplied. But what happens in the actual market, only the quantity supplied can actually be transacted, can actually be purchased. Fewer consumers as a result are going to get the good, and we're also going to see with this price ceiling in the way that we've graphed it here that the quantity will be Q1, which is less than quantity Q star, and so we have allocative inefficiency, which suggests a misallocation of resources. In other words, we're under allocating our resources. This very last one, D, price floors above equilibrium could relate to shortages. And even though definitionally a price floor is above the equilibrium, what results in this case is where we see quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. And as a result of that, we would get a surplus, not a shortage. So that's the part that's incorrect. Okay, so just note that. I'm just going to flip the slide so we can look at new concepts. Okay, and I'm just going to put a little bit of a drawing here so we can note this. We have here our market supply and demand. Kind of note that this supply curve, right? This is our supply curve, which is upward sloping, really relates to an earlier lesson where we looked at the concept of marginal cost. We looked at allocative efficiency as a relationship where marginal cost should be equal to marginal benefit. Allocative efficiency is all about a quantity that society wants, right? So it's all about efficiency in a market is all about, is the quantity Q that's produced by this market, the actual quantity of shoes or pencils or whatever it is that the quantity that society wants? And if we look at the supply curve as basically being marginal cost, and the demand curve is basically being marginal benefit, okay? Marginal benefit, we're measuring marginal benefit and how much are we willing to pay for the next unit of a shoe or the next unit of pencils, and based on our willingness to pay, we can assess how much do we, get a benefit as a society for the next pair of shoes or the next pencil, okay? So that's kind of where that correlation comes in. Markets that are efficient, okay, have one allocative efficient quantity. We're noting this where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So for our purposes, sorry that this turned off for a second. I hope that that's going to be okay. Turned off, went back on. So this is the allocative efficient quantity, Q star. The way that we might measure an economy that's very efficient, we're going to relate a concept that's called consumer and producer surplus. Now, in a previous video, we also used the word surplus to suggest when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, we get a surplus, right? So this might be in the case of a price floor, we might get a surplus of goods. Say that there was a price floor put on shoes and the price of shoes, went up dramatically. Suppliers would likely be stuck with lots and lots of pairs of shoes, and that's an actual surplus that at some point becomes a problem, for those suppliers, okay? Consumers, on the consumer side, there's some individuals who aren't able to pay for the shoes, okay? In our case of consumer and producer surplus, we're reusing the term surplus, but it really has a different context here. So don't get confused between surplus and shortage and the way that those are applied in a price control context. Consumer and producer surplus are actually going to be measured in a sense as a good thing, right? We want maximized consumer and producer surplus. It refers to an economy that is being efficient, where both consumers and producers get essentially a good deal, right? And you know what that feels like, right? So we use the example of Sam the other day, who was in trying to buy whatever, a laptop or something like that, and trying to get a lower price, for a good. So Sam comes to the table of the market, by having a willingness to pay. Maybe there's a price that Sam is willing to pay, and then there's a certain price that's just too high, not going to buy it until it like meets this particular willingness to pay. If the price is dramatically lower than what Sam was willing to pay, he experiences that feeling of a good deal. I got a great deal on that good, and we call that consumer surplus, okay? If this is, say, the market for pizza, let's suggest that this is the market for pizza, and we had quantities here. Every single quantity was like the next pizza, right? We might say, by looking at the demand curve, right, that for the consumers in this market are getting the price of P. Let's say that the price is $6 for a pizza, okay? But there are many, many consumers, okay, that if the price is, say, $10, we get consumers that are going to be willing to purchase that particular next pizza, the second pizza, the third pizza, and whatnot. People are willing to pay much greater than $6, okay? And there's kind of like, infinite number of consumers here who are willing to pay a price perhaps above $6, not infinite, but many consumers, more than I can draw points on this graph, that might be interested in paying above $6. Of course, there's also consumers that are not willing to pay $6 or above, right? And we know if we set the price at $6, what the quantity of pizzas will be bought and sold in this market. But lots and lots of folks on the demand curve are willing and able to pay greater than $6, okay? So if we kind of said for this, kind of $10 price, all the individuals who are willing to pay $10, right, to get that first pizza are getting some degree of consumer surplus, right? And because we're not using calculus in this course, a way that we can measure total consumer surplus is to actually just kind of shade this triangle here, the difference, in a sense, between the price that people actually pay in the market and all of these possible willingnesses to pay that would be greater than $6, okay? And I can actually use the area of a triangle, right? 1/2 times base times height of this triangle to actually figure out what the total consumer surplus is, okay? And the goal is to maximize consumer surplus. Why? Because it speaks to many consumers getting a price lower than what they're willing to pay. That's good for consumers. It speaks to a healthy market, okay? Likewise, on the producer side, okay, so this PS stands for producer surplus, there are some producers of pizza, right, who, when the price is much, much, much lower, are willing to produce the pizza, okay, but they actually get $6 as the price for the pizza. So some producers are also in the position of getting surplus. They're producing the pizza much more cheaply than the price that they're getting in the market, okay? However, there are some producers whose marginal costs, maybe they're paying wages that are higher, maybe their equipment fees are higher, they're in a location that's costs, rents are higher, whatever the issue is, they're paying more and their marginal costs are closer to $6. As soon as we get to that producer where the marginal cost is equal to $6, that producer is not any longer getting any producer surplus, okay? So like consumer surplus, we can actually measure producer surplus, okay, and look at the difference between what producers en masse, so for all the producers that are producing pizza, right, what do we see as a difference, okay, in the price that producers receive versus the quantity of versus the amount that producers would be willing to earn, right? Be willing to make as a they would make the pizza for less than $6, right? So their costs might be lower. So for every firm that is able to produce pizzas less than $6, they're getting a degree of producer surplus. If we were to calculate the entirety of producer surplus in this market, we would consider also using the formula for a triangle, 1/2 times base times height. What you can, and of course, if we had numbers, on this graph, we would be applying that formula to figure out a consumer and producer surplus. We actually measure consumer and producer surplus in dollars. So it's measured in like $500 worth of consumer surplus, $800, worth of producer surplus, okay? And this concept of taking both the maximum consumer and producer surplus, so what I have here in the green triangle is going to be referred to as total welfare, okay? Total welfare or total surplus. This is essentially a measure for economic efficiency. If we are maximizing total welfare, as we are in this graph, we know that we have an allocatively efficient market, okay? If we were to just put the definitions up, so this way you can address the definitions and put them in your notes, and you can kind of imagine, I'll draw a little description over here. If you imagine that, this was the used car that perhaps we were going to buy and sell, and let's imagine that we have a buyer, and the buyer is saying to themselves, I go into this market to buy this used car. Let's say it's a 93 Geoprism. The buyer says, you know what, I have $500 to pay for this particular, I have that in my pocket. I'd really like to pay maybe $200 for a new car, but I have $500 in my pocket. This is what I'm willing and able to pay. When the buyer comes to the market, this is the amount, that's on the demand curve. This individual can spend $500, but they're looking to go into the market to really spend, $200. Hopefully that's going to be closer to the equilibrium price. On the producer side, somebody who might be selling a used car, right, might be saying to themselves, well, I'd really like to get something like $100 for this car. It's barely running and maybe, whatever. But that's what I will receive as a minimum, rather. I, couldn't go for anything less because no point in selling it for less than $100. But for $100, get it off my plate, get it out of my driveway, and maybe that's a plus. But ideally, this individual might want to sell, this car for $300. So trying to earn a little bit of producer surplus. Okay, it's kind of like the benefit that a producer gets from selling a good, at a higher price than what they really, either paid to make it or their minimum price for selling it in the case of this used car. And if these two come together and haggle for a price, we can kind of assume that they're going to agree somewhere, in a price range of either, $200, $300, $400 somehow, depending on the negotiations. There's going to be a little bit of consumer and producer surplus. It doesn't have to work out that it's evenly 50-50, but in this case, we could actually calculate the consumer surplus and the producer surplus that each receives. If the equilibrium price or the agreed upon price ends up being something like, $300, we could say, well, the producer kind of earned, $200 of producer surplus. It's not actual money that the producer gets. It's that feeling of perhaps having some degree of a good deal. And the same thing with the buyer. The buyer might spend $300. The buyer was willing to was willing to pay $500. The difference between what the buyer was willing to pay and what the buyer actually pays is going to be consumer surplus. So the consumer is also earning $200 of surplus. The producer is also earning $200 of surplus, interested in selling it for $100, but actually gets $300, $200 greater than what they thought. Okay. If we were to calculate this and just kind of practice a little bit, the consumer surplus in this case, again, we're just going to use the area of a triangle. So if I'm looking at this red shaded area here as consumer surplus, okay, and in this case, I can see some consumers willing to pay $10, some consumers willing to pay $8, $6, and so on. But the equilibrium price is $5. So if we were to measure this, right, I'm just looking at 5 times 10, divided by a half, and that's going to give me the consumer surplus of $25, okay? In the case of the producer surplus, I can do the same thing, looking at the area of a triangle. In this case, it would be, 4, I'm looking at from 1 to 5, $4 times the 10 quantities of the good, and we might end up with, dividing this by a half, we'd end up with $20, okay? The total welfare, so this is measured in dollars, where consumer surplus is $25 total, producer surplus is $20 total, and our total welfare, right, what we see in kind of this green triangle right here, which you could also use, the area of a triangle to figure out, but we can also add, consumer surplus plus producer surplus and get the dollar amount of $45, okay? So we're just looking at this in terms of quantifying the total welfare, and I can see I've maximized my consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is always going to be found. The floor of your consumer surplus, if you will, is always going to be the equilibrium price, and we're always looking at the difference between all of the expression of prices in the demand curve and the difference between those prices and the price that people are actually getting in the market. And the same thing with producer surplus. We're looking at the upward part of producer surplus always being the $5 price, always being the price that people actually receive, and then the supply curve itself is indicating the expression of willingness, the producers who are incentivized to produce and maybe are willing to get a lower price, all of the good deals that a producer might get by selling the good for higher than what they're able to make it for. Okay, so just another example, a monetary example of how we measure consumer and producer plus. So how does deadweight loss, fit into this? And we're going to use the example of a price control as the example. And deadweight loss comes about in lots of circumstances. In this case, right, we have a market that's in equilibrium. If we look at this as supply curve 1, we can actually see the equilibrium price is going to be right here, PS, okay? And we can look at the equilibrium quantity, okay, as Q. Once we put in a price floor, and with the before the price floor, right, we have maximized consumer surplus in the blue, okay, and maximized producer surplus in the green, okay, so we have kind of a market that's allocatively efficient with the quantity at Q. As soon as we go to looking at a price floor, so here's our price floor. Let's say that this is milk, and we've just increased the price of milk. Now, with this price floor, we no longer have an equilibrium price, okay? We don't have an equilibrium price because there is no quantity where at this price, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, right? In fact, the quantity supplied is going to be at this, higher quantity up here. This is our quantity supplied, our quantity demanded at this higher price, which makes sense. That's the law of demand, is going to be much lower right here. This is actually going to be the quantity where the floor is that gets transacted. It doesn't really matter how much the suppliers make. If consumers only come in and buy up a certain amount, we end up with a situation where the quantity that's transacted in the market is going to be less. So how does that impact consumer and producer surplus? Well, if we look before, the blue outline here was the total maximum consumer surplus. Once we raise the price to the price floor, we actually get a higher price. So some of the folks on the demand curve are now going to be kind of out of luck from getting the good because they're not willing to pay that higher price. The new price is here, so this is going to be the bottom of our consumer surplus, and our consumer surplus is going to be this red area rather than the blue area, okay? And so we might note, wow, we have some, lost consumer surplus, right? Consumer surplus that used to exist in this blue area. Now what I'm outlining in the yellow, this like trapezoidal shape, this is kind of lost consumer surplus. So, what happens to that consumer surplus? Well, because there's a higher price, some producers are going to benefit, but the producer surplus is going to look a little different than before, okay? So if we say the consumer surplus is totally in red, it's a smaller triangle than it was before, what does the producer surplus look like, okay? Well, we still have a good amount of producer surplus. In fact, the price is higher than it was before. At PS, this was the point where our producer surplus, was kind of, this was the maximum price of our producer surplus. Now it's higher. So I can shade in green everything that's in my producer surplus, okay? Here is that trapezoidal shape. Everything in green is my producer surplus, okay? I'm using the new price to kind of suggest some producers are actually able to get that high price for the quantity of goods that they're producing. And for some of the producers, right, they're getting more surplus because the price is higher than it was before. So for a producer that was like willing to, or able to make the good at this price, all the way down here, now they're getting not PS, but they're getting the price floor price. So they get more surplus. One thing that is notable, however, is we have this like weird section here in yellow that's kind of lost consumer and producer surplus. Before this part of the yellow, the top part was like consumer surplus, producer surplus, and this can no longer be included in the green or red consumer or producer surplus. This yellow is basically suggesting that, these transactions, the transactions between quantity of the floor and the quantity that was allocatively efficient, no longer happen in this market. Once the price went up, the quantity demanded kind of dropped off. The quantity transacted in the market earns producer and consumer surplus, but the transactions that don't happen in the market, that's going to equate dead weight loss. Okay, so by definition, dead weight loss is essentially a loss in total welfare. Okay, so before, if our total welfare was a dollar amount, like $45, and now we actually have a dollar amount that we can measure dead weight loss. We could actually quantify this, measure dead weight loss, and subtract it from total welfare. This is, by definition, a way of measuring inefficiency. If we have dead weight loss, this triangle exists in a market that was efficient. We had maximized consumer and producer surplus. Now we have dead weight loss. We are automatically not allocatively efficient, right? So the presence of dead weight loss is showcasing this gap between the allocative efficient quantity and the quantity that's actually transacted in the market, okay? In the case of a price ceiling, we will also have a situation of dead weight loss for a similar reason. The only difference with a price ceiling is you're going to end up in a situation where the consumer is going to be made a little bit better off than the producer is. But from the economics perspective, we still have allocative inefficiency and we still have dead weight loss. Okay, so consider this a little bit. We'll talk about it more in class, but I will see you soon. Have a good rest of the weekend.